It was several years ago, but the memory is still burned into my brain like it happened yesterday. Recently, something made me think about it again, and I had to ask my wife if I had imagined the whole thing, because it was that bizarre. But no, she remembered it exactly the same way. It was a scorching hot night, close to 100 Fahrenheit, even though the sun had been down for hours. My wife and I were driving along a quiet road just north of the Mexican border, a stretch of pavement we had traveled almost daily. It was familiar, but that night, it felt off in a way I couldn't quite explain. The road was mostly empty, lined with a high wall on one side and an open field filled with large rocks on the other. It wasn't well lit, and there were no other cars in sight. Normally, we'd have music playing, but the radio had been acting up, cutting in and out, so we had turned it off. That left us sitting in heavy silence, listening only to the sound of the tires on the pavement. It was one of those nights where the air felt too still, too quiet, like something was just waiting to happen. That's when we saw him. A man was lying face down in the gutter, right at the edge of the sidewalk. He was wearing a light blue button-down shirt, blue jeans, and brown shoes, completely normal clothes, nothing ragged or torn. But what struck me was that his clothes were clean. If he had collapsed or had been hit by a car, there should have been dirt, blood, something. But he looked pristine, like someone had gently placed him there. It all happened in the span of a few seconds, but it felt like time slowed down. My wife immediately said we needed to stop to check if he was breathing. Instinctively, I slowed down, but my gut was already screaming at me that something was wrong. Before I could even think about it, I told her, "Stay in the car." She must have heard the edge in my voice because she didn't argue. Instead, she started looking around, trying to see what I had felt. That's when we really noticed the details. There were huge boulders from the field that had been dragged close to the road, but not naturally. There were fresh streaks of dirt, like someone had recently moved them. And then, just beyond the boulders, a faint blue light flickered. It looked exactly like a phone screen, held low, just out of sight, as if someone was watching us. The second I looked toward it, the light vanished. I didn't hesitate. I punched the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. As we sped away, I instinctively glanced at the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw them. 5 men burst out from behind the boulders. They had been waiting. They had been watching. And when they realized their trap had failed, they stopped mid-stride, just standing in the dark, watching us drive away. One of them reached down and helped the man in the gutter up. He was fine. It was a setup. For a few minutes, we didn't say a word. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My wife was sitting stiffly in her seat, eyes wide, breathing too fast. When we reached our destination, I immediately grabbed my phone and called the police. I gave them the exact location, described what had happened, and waited for some kind of urgent response. Instead, the officer on the other end just sounded tired. "Yeah, we'll look into it," he said, with absolutely zero urgency in his voice. It was clear they weren't going to do a damn thing. I was still reeling from the adrenaline dump when, a few days later, I saw a news report. There had been an attack in town late at night. A driver had stopped when they saw a man lying in the road, thinking he was injured, and was immediately ambushed by multiple attackers. Somehow, the victim managed to escape. The news didn't say exactly where it happened, but I knew. It was that same road, that same setup. That could have been us. Even now, years later, I still wonder what would have happened if I had stopped, if I had gotten out of the car, if I hadn't noticed the boulders, the phone light, the off feeling in my gut. We were seconds away from a completely different ending. It was about 6 years ago when my friend Tom and I decided to take a trip to a casino on an Ojibwe reserve. We were staying at my parents' cabin for the weekend, and since the casino was about 40 minutes away, we figured we'd kill some time, maybe win a little money, and grab a good meal while we were at it. The drive there was easy enough, but that stretch of highway was eerie at night, completely surrounded by thick forest, with no streetlights and barely any traffic. Just an endless, dark road with nothing but the headlights cutting through the night. We ended up having a pretty solid night at the casino. Won some money, played a few table games, had a nice dinner, and before we knew it, it was already past 1 a.m. Definitely later than I would have liked, considering how dark the drive back was going to be. But there wasn't much we could do about it, so we got in the car and started heading back. For the first 20 minutes, we didn't see a single other car, just the road, the trees, and the occasional flicker of wildlife off in the distance. Then, just as we were approaching a hill, I saw something reflecting in the dark. 2 green orbs just off the road. Deer. I slammed the brakes and waited. Sure enough, a small herd of them crossed right in front of us. Once they were clear, I started up the hill again, going slow since we had just stopped. We had just reached the crest of the hill when Tom suddenly yelled out, "Holy shit!" Right in front of us, walking directly down the middle of our lane, was a young woman. She was maybe 30 feet away, walking towards us. I slammed on the brakes again, and we came to a stop just 10 feet from her. But that wasn't the worst part. She was barefoot, dressed in a thin white nightgown, her pitch-black hair hanging down her back. And she didn't react at all. She just kept walking forward, completely expressionless. Tom and I sat there frozen. It was one of the creepiest things I had ever seen, like something ripped straight out of a horror movie. We expected her to stop, maybe come up to the window and ask for help, but she didn't. She walked right up to my car, her blank eyes staring straight ahead, and then, without hesitation, she dragged her hand along the driver's side door as she continued past us. The sound of her fingers scraping against the metal made my skin crawl. Tom panicked immediately. "Dude, let's go. Let's just get the hell out of here." And honestly, every instinct in me was screaming the same thing, but something felt off. I don't know if it was guilt or curiosity, or maybe just the sheer weirdness of it all, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to check on her. I looked in the rearview mirror. She was still walking down the road, moving like she was in a trance. I turned to Tom. "I'm gonna ask if she's okay." Tom snapped his head toward me. "Dude, are you insane? Just drive. Just leave her alone." But I had already made up my mind. I flipped on the hazards, opened my door, and stepped out. The car's interior lights barely did anything, but the blinking orange glow of the hazards let me see her silhouette moving down the hill. I hesitated. Then, half yelling, I called out, "Hey, are you all right?" She stopped walking, didn't turn around, didn't move, just stood there, completely still. The silence stretched on too long. Tom, now completely freaked out, got out of the car and walked around to stand next to me. We both just stood there, waiting. Then she screamed. It was loud, sharp, and inhumanly high-pitched. We didn't wait to find out what happened next. We bolted back to the car, jumped in, and sped the hell out of there. Tom chewed me out the whole way back to the cabin. "I told you not to stop. What the hell was that? Dude, she wasn't normal." And honestly, I had no argument. We didn't see a single other car for the rest of the drive. To this day, I have no idea what that was. Was she lost? On something? Sleepwalking? Or was it something else entirely? All I know is that I never want to see anything like that again. I was 18 years old and finally heading home to California for summer break after finishing my sophomore year of college. It was a long 9-hour drive, so I did what any young, dumb, and caffeine-fueled college kid would do. I stocked up on energy drinks, soda, and snacks to keep me awake. I left pretty late, right after dinner with some friends, planning to drive straight through the night and get home by morning. Everything was going smoothly, and I was making great time. I was about 3 hours from home, somewhere an hour outside Reno, on one of those desolate stretches of highway where you don't see another car for miles. And of course, that's when the energy drinks came back to haunt me. The urge to pee hit me hard, and I instantly regretted not stopping at the last gas station 45 minutes ago when I had the chance. Just when I thought I might have to pull over and water a bush, I saw a sign for a rest stop ahead. Perfect. I took the exit and pulled in. The parking lot was almost empty except for 2 vehicles, a beat-up sedan that looked like it had seen better days, and a Sprinter-style van parked on the other side. I didn't think much of it. I was laser-focused on making it to the bathroom before I embarrassed myself. I hurried inside, took care of business, and was just about to flush when I heard the bathroom door creak open. I froze. Now, I'm not a small guy, but I'm not exactly built for a fight either. 1,000 horror movie scenarios ran through my mind as I braced myself for some Michael Myers-type situation. I slowly pushed open the stall door and saw a regular-looking dude standing near the urinal. He was average height, wearing mechanic-style coveralls with grease stains all over them. He looked up, gave me a friendly smile, and went back to doing his thing. I exhaled and told myself I was being paranoid. I walked over to the sink, washed my hands, and was about to leave when he suddenly spoke. His voice was low and gravelly, almost like he had a permanent smoker's rasp. "You like dogs, man?" he asked casually as he scrubbed his hands under the faucet. I hesitated. Something about the way he said it felt off. Still, not wanting to be rude, I forced a smile and replied, "Yeah, man, dogs are cool." Then I turned toward the door, ready to get the hell out of there. Big mistake. Before I even made it a few steps outside, he was right behind me, practically on my heels. "I got a new puppy," he said, his voice too eager, too forced. "Real cute. Want to see him?" Instant panic. My creeper radar was going off like crazy. I gripped my keys in one hand and had my phone in the other, my mind racing through all the worst-case scenarios. "No thanks. Gotta get going," I said quickly, fumbling to get into my car. But before I could shut the door, he grabbed it. He was strong. Despite being a bit smaller than me, he yanked the door open with ease, keeping me trapped. That's when he leaned in and said something that made my blood run cold. "By the time the cops get here, you'll already be dead." Everything in my body screamed run. Without thinking, I kicked out hard, my foot slamming into his stomach. The force knocked him flat on his ass, and I didn't wait around to see what he did next. I yanked the door shut, locked it, and floored it out of there. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I saw him scrambling toward his car. I didn't wait to see if he was going to follow me. I just drove like hell, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds, fully expecting to see headlights chasing me down the highway. For the next 3 hours, my heart didn't stop racing. I was convinced that at any moment, he'd come speeding up behind me, run me off the road, and finish what he started. When I finally pulled into my driveway, my dad was still awake, waiting for me. I told him everything, still shaking, still running through every awful scenario in my head. But instead of calling the cops, he just shook his head. "Nothing they can do now," he said. "You got away. That's what matters." Maybe he was right. But from that night on, I never stopped at a rest stop after dark again. My mom, Lorena, had this terrifying encounter back in the late 70s or early 80s, long before I was born. She was in her mid to late 20s, living near Miami, Florida, and working on a Club Med cruise ship as a casino dealer. She also performed as a singer when she could, so her schedule was all over the place, and she was often driving home at ridiculous hours. Given that lifestyle, it was probably inevitable that she'd have at least one really bad experience. This particular night, it was around 2 or 3 in the morning, and she was heading home on one of those long, empty Florida highways, the kind that stretches for miles without a single streetlight, surrounded by nothing but thick swampland. The type of place where if your car breaks down, you're screwed. And of course, that's exactly what happened. 1 minute she was cruising along, the next, the engine stuttered and died. She coasted to a stop on the shoulder of the highway, turned the key a few times, and got nothing but silence. No cell phones, no emergency roadside assistance, and definitely no houses nearby. Just an empty, dark road and a whole lot of gators lurking somewhere in the swamps. At first, she tried to stay calm. She figured she'd just sit tight and wait for another car to pass. Surely someone would stop and help, right? Wrong. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. She started realizing that, at this time of night, most people probably assumed she was either waiting for a drug deal or that stopping to help her might put themselves in danger. Either way, nobody wanted to get involved. And then, finally, a car pulled over. It stopped about 400 feet behind her, sitting in the shoulder with its headlights still on. At first, she felt a wave of relief. Someone had actually stopped. Maybe this person could help get her car running or give her a ride into town. But then, minutes passed, and the driver didn't move. He just sat there, engine running, headlights glaring, completely still. Something felt wrong. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe he was just debating whether or not to help. Maybe he was making a phone call. Maybe he was waiting for her to signal that she needed assistance. But deep down, she knew better. Her heart started pounding. Then, after nearly 10 minutes, the driver's side door slowly opened. A man stepped out. He was alone. He walked to the trunk of his car, popped it open, took something out, and began walking toward her car. Slowly. Way too slowly. Nobody moves like that if they're just coming over to offer help. That's when she saw what he was carrying. A wrench. Not jumper cables, not a gas can, not a toolbox. A big-ass wrench, gripped tightly in one hand as he kept walking toward her car without saying a word. Everything in her body screamed, "Run!" But her car was dead, and she was trapped. She thought about getting out and running into the woods. But that was a death sentence too. Gators, snakes, God knows what else. She thought about locking the doors and pretending not to be there, but he'd already seen her. She was out of options. And then, out of nowhere, a tow truck appeared. The bright floodlights of the truck lit up the whole highway as it sped past, then suddenly slammed on the brakes and did a sharp U-turn. It pulled up right next to her car, stopping between her and the man with the wrench. The guy turned on his heel, sprinted back to his car and took off. The tow truck driver got out, took one look at her and said, "You okay?" She could barely get the words out. He helped her into his truck, and as they started driving away, she finally managed to ask, "Why did you stop?" His answer? "I saw that guy's face. He was up to no good." That's it. No hesitation, no doubt. Just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. She never found out who that man was, what he wanted to do, or what would have happened if the tow truck hadn't shown up. But she's convinced that if she had been alone just a few minutes longer, she wouldn't have made it home that night.